The ink had not yet dried on the paper when Isolde heard the wheels. She did not look up. She knew the sound of a carriage arriving on the East Drive, the particular crunch of gravel beneath iron-rimmed wheels, the way the sound carried differently in the morning air than it did at dusk, when the stone walls of Elderfield Park absorbed everything into their ancient warmth. This was a morning sound, bright, unhurried, the kind of arrival that expected welcome. Isolde finished the sentence she was writing. Her hand was steady, her script clean and precise, the letters formed with the same care she applied to every piece of correspondence that left this house bearing the Elderfield seal. She set the pen down, lifted the paper by its edge, and blew gently across the ink. 5 words. She read them once, then again, and then she folded the paper with 2 exact creases and reached for the wax. He prefers Tuesdays, not Sundays. The seal pressed into the crimson wax with a satisfying weight, her personal seal, not the ducal one. The crane crest, which she had carried into this marriage, and which Caspian had never once asked her to set aside. A small bird in flight above a single stem of lavender. She had chosen it herself at 17, before she had known what a duke was, before she had understood what it meant to marry one, before she had learned that the grandest houses in England could hold more silence than any more. She rang the bell beside her writing desk. Once, the sound was thin and clear in the morning room, where pale sunlight fell in long rectangles across the carpet, and the fire had not yet been lit. It was early still, 8:30, and the house was only beginning to stir. The sounds of distant footsteps and opening doors, filtering through the corridors like the first movements of an orchestra, tuning before a performance. Mrs. Paget appeared in the doorway within a minute. She was already dressed for the day, her ring of keys at her waist, her expression composed in the particular way that suggested she, too, had heard the wheels. "Your Grace, Mrs. Paget, there is a carriage approaching the east gate. I should like our carriage brought round to meet it at the lodge. Briggs is to deliver this." Isolde held out the folded, sealed note. "He is to hand it to the occupant directly, wait until the carriage has turned, and then return." Mrs. Paget took the note. Her eyes did not move to it. They remained on Isolde's face, and in that brief exchange, a fraction of a second, no more, an understanding passed between them that required no elaboration. Mrs. Paget had been housekeeper at Elderfield for 11 years. She had served the previous Duchess, who had died when Caspian was 19. She had watched Isolde arrive as a bride of 22, watched her learn the house, watched her take its reins with a competence that surprised everyone except, it seemed, Isolde herself. And she had watched other things too, the letters that arrived on certain days, the absences that fell on others, the way the Duke's valet packed a particular bag when the Duke was meant to be visiting his solicitor in London. "Shall I instruct Briggs regarding anything further, Your Grace?" "No, the note is sufficient." Mrs. Paget curtsied and withdrew. Isolde listened to her footsteps receding down the corridor, brisk, purposeful, the keys not jangling because Mrs. Paget held them when she walked quickly, and then she turned back to the window. From the morning room she could not see the east gate. That was deliberate. She had chosen this room for her correspondence precisely because it faced west, across the gardens and the ornamental lake, where the light was best in the mornings and where nothing arrived unannounced. The East Drive, the lodge, the gate, those belonged to a different geography of the house, one she had no intention of watching today. What she had set in motion would happen without her witness, and that was the point. She had known about Miss Vane for 7 months, not suspected, not wondered, not pieced together from whispered fragments overheard through doorways or from the pitying glances of acquaintances who knew more than they should. Known, with the particular clarity that comes when a woman pays attention to her own household and finds that the household has been paying attention back. The knowledge had arrived not as a blow but as a completion, the final piece of a pattern she had been tracing without realizing it. The Tuesday absences, the particular cologne he wore on those evenings that was not the one she had chosen for him, the way his valet pressed a different shirt for those nights, finer linen, French cuffs, as though dressing the Duke for a performance that his wife was not meant to attend. It had been Thorne who confirmed it, though he had not meant to. Thorne, the steward, a man of impeccable discretion, whose only failing was that he kept his accounts too meticulously. Isolde had been reviewing the estate ledgers one afternoon in November, a task she performed monthly, not because Thorne required oversight, but because she believed that a duchess who did not understand her own household's finances was a duchess in name only, and she had found an entry for a furnished house in Curzon Street. The rent was paid quarterly from the estate's private accounts, the ones that did not pass through the general household ledger. Thorne had filed it under sundry expenditures, which was technically accurate and practically transparent to anyone who knew what sundry expenditures at that scale actually meant. She had said nothing, not to Thorne, who would have been mortified, not to Mrs. Paget, who already knew, and certainly not to Caspian, who believed, as men of his station so often believed, that the architecture of discretion was the same thing as the architecture of secrecy. It was not. Discretion meant that the Tun did not discuss it openly at supper. Secrecy would have required his wife not to notice, and Isolde noticed everything. She had spent the winter deciding, not deciding whether to act, that had never been in question, but deciding how, and when, and with what degree of precision. She had considered a confrontation. She had imagined it in detail, the drawing room, the fire, her voice steady, his face shifting from surprise to defense to that particular species of aristocratic indignation that men deployed when caught and unwilling to admit it. She had played the scene through a dozen times in her mind, and each time it had ended the same way, with raised voices, or worse, with lowered ones, and with nothing resolved except that both of them would know she had been wounded, and he would carry that knowledge like a weapon he had not asked for but would not discard. No, a confrontation would give him the shape of her pain, and she had no intentions of giving him that. She had considered writing to Miss Vane directly. A formal letter, Duchess, to what? What was the correct term? The etiquette books did not cover this particular correspondence. She had dismissed the idea quickly. It placed her in communication with a woman she had no wish to communicate with, and it suggested that the matter lay between the two of them, which it did not. This was not about Miss Vane. Miss Vane was a symptom. The disease was simpler and older. A husband who had married for alliance and assumed that alliance was all his wife would ever require. And then, 3 weeks ago, she had received word, through Briggs, who was loyal to her in the quiet, absolute way that good servants chose their loyalties, that Miss Vane intended to visit Elderfield. Not London, where such arrangements were conducted behind the polite fiction of separate social calendars. Elderfield, the family seat, the house where Isolde managed the staff, planned the meals, oversaw the gardens, greeted the tenants, and slept in the Duchess's chambers that had been occupied by Caspian's mother before her. It was, by any measure, a provocation. Whether Miss Vane understood it as such was irrelevant. What mattered was that she had decided to bring the arrangement out of London and into Isolde's house, and Isolde had decided, in the moment she learned of it, exactly what she would do. The note had been written in her mind for 3 weeks before she set pen to paper this morning. Now she opened her correspondence case and began her letters for the day. There were 4, one to the vicar's wife regarding the midsummer fete, one to her sister in Bath, one to the milliner in Mayfair, who was holding 2 bonnets for her approval, and one to the tenant farmer, Mr. Hadlow, whose youngest daughter was to be apprenticed, and who had written requesting a character reference from the Duchess. Isolde composed each with her full attention, her handwriting never faltering, her sentences clear and warm and particular. She could hear, distantly, the sound of their carriage being brought round, the clatter of hooves on the stable-yard cobblestones, Briggs's voice giving instructions to the groom, and she did not pause. By the time she had sealed the last letter, the house had gone quiet again, the particular quiet that follows a departure when the air itself seems to resettle. Mrs. Paget appeared in the doorway. "Briggs has returned, Your Grace. Thank you. The carriage at the gate departed shortly after receiving your note. Briggs reports that the occupant read it, instructed her driver, and left without reply. Very good." Mrs. Paget hesitated, not visibly, not in any way that a casual observer would have detected, but Isolde knew her hesitations the way she knew the house's sounds. "Is there anything else, Mrs. Paget?" "His Grace is expected back from the Northfield within the hour. Shall I have breakfast laid in the dining room or the small parlor?" "The dining room, I think, for 2. "Very good, Your Grace." Alone again, Isolde permitted herself one moment, just one, of something that was not composure. She pressed her fingers to the edge of the desk and breathed, and in that breath was everything she had not written in the note and would not speak aloud. The 7 months of knowing, the winter of deciding, the particular loneliness of a marriage conducted in adjacence rather than intimacy. She had married Caspian Rowe 3 years ago in the chapel at Elderfield, with 200 guests and a gown of ivory silk and a conviction, not romantic, not naive, but certain, that a marriage between sensible people could be built into something more than its origins. She had been right about the house. She had been right about the staff, the tenants, the gardens, the estate. She had been wrong about the marriage, or rather, she had been right about it too slowly for Caspian to notice. She released the desk edge. She smoothed her skirts, pale cream muslin, embroidered at the hem with small sage leaves, entirely appropriate for a Tuesday morning, and she stood. There were menus to approve with Mrs. Paget and a letter from the glazier about the orangery windows. The day had work in it, and Isolde had never once failed to do her work. Caspian returned from the north field at 10:30, mud on his boots and the particular energy of a man who had spent the morning on horseback, discussing drainage with his land agent. He came through the side entrance, as was his habit, and handed his riding crop to the footman and his gloves to his valet, and he was halfway up the stairs before Thorne intercepted him. Isolde did not witness this. She learned of it later, from Mrs. Paget, who had it from the hall boy, who had been polishing the banister and had heard every word. But she could imagine it with precision, because she knew Thorne, and she knew her husband, and she knew the particular way that information traveled through a great house, not in straight lines but in spirals, touching every surface before arriving at its destination. Your Grace, a word, if I may. Caspian would have paused on the stair. He would have looked down at Thorne with the expression he reserved for interruptions, not unkind, but not patient either, the face of a man who had already decided what his next hour contained and did not wish to renegotiate. What is it, Thorne? A carriage arrived at the east gate this morning, Your Grace. The Duchess instructed that our carriage meet it there. Briggs delivered a note to the occupant. The carriage departed. A silence. Isolde could imagine this silence very precisely, the way it would have filled the stairwell, pressing against the paneled walls, displacing the ordinary sounds of a household in motion. Whose carriage? I was not informed of the occupant's identity, Your Grace, only that the Duchess gave the instruction and Briggs carried it out. Thorne would not have lied. Thorne did not lie. It was one of his few absolute principles, along with balanced ledgers and properly maintained guttering. But he also would not have volunteered what he had not been asked. Caspian would have recognized this, the steward's particular brand of honesty that answered the question posed and no other. Where is the Duchess? In the still room, I believe, Your Grace. She has been reviewing the preserves inventory with Mrs. Paget. Caspian did not go to the still room. Isolde knew this because she was in the still room until 11:15, counting jars of damson jam with Mrs. Paget and discussing whether the quince harvest would be sufficient for the Christmas gifts they distributed to the tenants each year, and he did not appear. He went instead to his study, where he remained behind a closed door for the better part of an hour. Isolde did not wonder what he was doing behind that door. She did not need to wonder. She knew her husband's patterns the way she knew the house. Intimately, structurally, without romance, he would be sitting at his desk. He would not be reading. He would be replaying the morning in his mind, constructing the scene from the fragments Thorne had given him, arriving at the conclusion that Isolde had already reached and acted upon. He would be realizing, perhaps for the first time, that his wife had known about Miss Vane, not suspected, known, and that she had chosen not to confront him, not to weep, not to rage, but to send a carriage and a note with 5 words that contained more intelligence about his own life than he had credited her with possessing. He prefers Tuesdays, not Sundays. It was, of course, true. Caspian visited Curzon Street on Tuesdays. He had established the pattern early in the arrangement, when his parliamentary schedule. He sat in the House of Lords most weeks when the session was active, as was expected of a duke of his standing, left Tuesdays as the only consistent evening without obligation. Isolde had known this since November. The note told Miss Vane nothing she did not already know, and it told Caspian everything. It told him that Isolde knew the day, which meant she knew the address, which meant she knew the woman, which meant she had known for some time, long enough to learn the schedule, long enough to let it continue, long enough to decide, with the unhurried precision of a woman who planned her quince preserves 6 months in advance, exactly how and when to act. They met at luncheon. The dining room, as Isolde had requested, laid for 2. Bright afternoon light through the tall windows, the silver gleaming, the flowers, early roses from the garden, the first of the season, their petals the color of blush and cream, arranged in a low centerpiece that did not obstruct the view across the table. The mahogany surface had been polished that morning by the footman until it reflected the light like dark water, and the place settings were precise, each fork and knife aligned with the invisible geometry that Mrs. Paget's training demanded of the household staff. Isolde was already seated when Caspian entered. She had chosen her chair deliberately, not at the far end where formality would have placed her, but at the near end, where the light fell best and where the distance between them was conversational rather than ceremonial. She looked up from her soup and smiled. Not warmly, not coldly, but with the composed courtesy she extended to every meal they shared, which was most meals because whatever else their marriage lacked, it had never lacked civility. "Good afternoon," she said. "How was the North Field?" He sat, he unfolded his napkin. She watched his hands, large hands, capable hands, the hands of a man who rode and shot and managed land with genuine competence, and she noted that they were not entirely steady. "The drainage is resolved. Hadlow's lower pasture should hold through autumn now. I am glad to hear it. I had a letter from Mr. Hadlow this morning regarding his daughter's apprenticeship. I shall write a character reference." "That is good of you." "It is my duty. She is a tenant's child and she has been well raised." They ate. The soup was asparagus from the kitchen garden prepared by Mrs. Hatch, the cook, who had been at Elderfield long enough to know that the Duchess preferred her asparagus soup without cream, and the Duke preferred his with 2 tureens, a small accommodation that Mrs. Hatch made without being asked, because the kitchen at Elderfield ran on the principle that anticipation was superior to instruction. Caspian set down his spoon. "Isolde." She looked up. His use of her Christian name at table was unusual. They were formal people in formal rooms. It was one of the things she had accepted about this marriage early, that it conducted itself in the language of courtesy rather than intimacy. When he used her name, her actual name, not your grace, not Duchess, not the absent my dear, that some husband scattered through conversation like loose change, it meant that the architecture of the meal had shifted and they were now in different territory. "Yes? A carriage came to the east gate this morning." "Yes, you sent ours to meet it." "I did, with a note, that is correct." He was watching her face with an expression she had not seen before, or rather, she had seen its components separately, but never assembled in this configuration. There was wariness, which she recognized from his early days in the House Longsword, when a debate turned and he found himself outmaneuvered. There was something close to admiration, which she recognized from the few occasions when she had managed the household through a crisis. A collapsed wall in the east wing, a fever among the stable boys, with an efficiency that surprised him, and beneath both of those, held carefully below the surface like a fish beneath still water, there was shame. "You knew," he said. "Yes, how long?" 7 months. The number landed in the dining room like a stone dropped into a well. 7 months. She watched him absorb it, not just the duration, but what it implied. 7 months of knowing and saying nothing. 7 months of sitting across this table, sharing asparagus soup, discussing tenants and drainage and the glazier's estimates for the orangery, all while carrying the knowledge of Curzon Street like a stone in her pocket that she had chosen not to throw. "Why did you not?" "Confront you? Make a scene? Weep into my pillow and summon my mother?" Isolde's voice was level, not hard, not cold, level, the way a horizon line is level, simply the truth of where things stand. Because none of those actions would have changed anything, and all of them would have diminished me. "I did not marry you to diminish myself, Caspian." He said nothing, she continued, because the words had been composed over 7 months, and they emerged now with the same precision as the note. "I married you because the match was sensible, and because I believed that a sensible match, tended properly, could become something more. I have tended it. I have tended this house, your staff, your tenants, your reputation, your comfort. I have sat beside you at dinners and stood beside you at church and managed your household with the competence of a woman who takes her position seriously, and you have taken a mistress in Curzon Street and visited her on Tuesdays. I'm not finished." She said it quietly, without raising her voice, and the quietness was more arresting than volume would have been. "I do not object to the arrangement because I am wounded, though I am. I object because it is inefficient. You have a wife who is capable, intelligent, and present, and you have chosen to conduct your private life as though she were none of those things. That is your miscalculation, not mine." The word hung between them, miscalculation, and Isolde saw the moment it reached him. Not the emotion of it, but the accuracy. She had chosen a word from his vocabulary, the language of strategy and assessment, because she knew it would reach him faster than any term of feeling. He was a man who understood miscalculations. He had made them in the Lords, in land management, in the breeding of his horses. He understood what it meant to have been wrong, not in intention but in measurement, to have underestimated a variable that turned out to be the most significant one in the equation. "The note," he said, 5 words. "He prefers Tuesdays, not Sundays. She arrived on a Sunday," I corrected her. "You did not tell her to leave. I did not need to." The note told her everything she needed to understand, that I know, that I have known, and that I am not the wife she was expecting to find. Caspian looked down at the table, at the roses, the silver, the 2 soup tureens, one with cream, one without. The small accommodations of a household run by a woman who noticed everything and anticipated the rest. "She will not return," he said. "No, she will not. The arrangement is finished." Isolde studied him. She had spent 3 years studying this man, his habits, his silences, his particular way of holding his jaw when he was embarrassed, which he was now. She had studied him the way she studied the household accounts, with attention, with patience, with the expectation that the numbers would eventually tell her something true. Is it finished because you wish it to be, or because you have been caught? The question was precise and deliberate, and it required him to answer honestly or not at all. She watched him choose. "Both," he said, "and I am not proud of that." It was, she thought, the first honest sentence he had spoken to her in a year. Not the most comfortable, not the most romantic, but the first one that bore weight. Both. He could have lied. He could have claimed a sudden awakening, a moral reckoning, a realization that had nothing to do with the note and everything to do with his own conscience. He did not. He said both, and in doing so he gave her something she had not expected and did not fully trust but recognized as valuable. The truth, delivered without performance. "I am not asking for an apology," she said. "Apologies are words, and I have never found your words to be the most reliable part of you. I am asking for a change, and I am telling you that the change begins with the understanding that I am not a fixture of this house. I am its architect. Every comfort you enjoy here, the meals, the fires, the linens, the gardens, the tenants who speak well of you, the staff who anticipate your needs, exists because I built it. Not because you asked me to, but because I decided that if I was to live in this house, it would be run properly." She stood. Not dramatically, she simply finished her soup, blotted her lips with her napkin, and rose from her chair with the same composure with which she had sat down. "I shall be in the garden this afternoon. The roses want attention." She left him at the table. She did not look back, not because she was making a point, but because looking back was not her habit. She moved forward, through doorways, through seasons, through the long corridors of a marriage that had finally, after 3 years, arrived at the beginning of something honest. Caspian did not come to the garden that afternoon. She had not expected him to. The shift she had initiated was not the kind that resolved in an afternoon. It was structural, like resetting the foundation of a house that had been built on imprecise measurements. He went to his study and wrote 2 letters. She learned this from Thorne later, who noted the postage in his meticulous accounts, and one of them went to London. The Curzon Street house was let to a new tenant by the end of the month. Thorne recorded the cessation of the quarterly rent with a single line in the ledger, and Isolde, reviewing it in July, noted it without comment and turned the page. The change was not sudden. It arrived the way seasons change at Elderfield, gradually, with small alterations that accumulated into transformation. Caspian began joining her in the morning room after breakfast, where previously he had gone directly to his study or the stables. He asked about the orangery repairs, which he had never shown interest in before. He accompanied her on a visit to the Hadlow farm, where the daughter had begun her apprenticeship with the dressmaker in the village, and he watched his wife speak to the family with a warmth and specificity that revealed how deeply she knew these people, their names, their children's ages, the particular challenges of their tenancy. He began to see her. It was, she thought, rather late for that, but lateness was not the same as absence, and Isolde was a practical woman who understood that some things grew better in their second season than their first. He sat beside her at the midsummer feast, where previously he had circulated separately, and when the vicar's wife complimented the Duchess on the event's organization, the garlands, the music, the trestle tables heavy with food from the estate's own farms, Caspian said, clearly and publicly, "The Duchess is the reason Elderfield functions. I am merely the man whose name is on the deed." It was said lightly, with the self-deprecating charm that came naturally to him. But Isolde heard the weight beneath it, an acknowledgment delivered before witnesses that she was not the ornament of this estate but its engine. She inclined her head in thanks and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Autumn brought the harvest, and with it the rhythms that Isolde loved best. The counting, the planning, the smell of turned earth and stored grain, the particular golden quality of October light as it slanted through the library windows and fell across the estate maps spread on the table. She walked the grounds with Thorn each morning during harvest week, inspecting the grain stores and the root cellars, noting which fields had yielded well and which would need resting the following year, and she planned the Christmas tenants' gifts with Mrs. Paget. Quince preserves, as expected. The harvest had been generous after all, alongside new woolen blankets from the mill in the next county and wrapped parcels of candles for each household. Caspian accompanied her on these walks more often than not, and she noticed, without commenting, without adjusting, that he had begun asking Thorn questions about the household accounts, not because he doubted her management, but because he wished to understand it. The first time he brought her flowers from the garden, a loose, imperfect bunch of late-blooming dahlias, their stems unevenly cut. She looked at them for a long moment and then placed them in the blue vase on her writing desk without rearranging them. "They are not well cut," he said, standing in the doorway of the morning room with the expression of a man who had attempted something outside his competence and knew it. "No," she agreed. "But they are from the garden, and you brought them yourself, and both of those things matter more than the cut." Winter came, and with it the long evenings that were Elderfield's particular gift, the house drawn in upon itself, the fires lit in every room, the candles casting their warm, unsteady light across walls that had held this family for 5 generations. Caspian began reading in the drawing room in the evenings, in the chair beside Isolde's, where previously he had taken his book to the study. They did not always speak, but the silence between them had changed in texture. It was no longer the silence of two people occupying the same house, by contractual obligation, but the silence of two people who had chosen, after difficulty, to remain in the same room. On a Tuesday evening in February, a Tuesday, and neither of them remarked upon the day, Caspian looked up from his book and said, "I should like to accompany you to Bath in the spring, to visit your sister." Isolde looked up. "You have never wished to visit my sister before." "No, I have never understood before why I should. I understand now that the things you love are the things I should make an effort to know." It was not poetry, it was not a declaration. It was the kind of sentence that a man who had spent a year rebuilding something spoke when he meant it plain, structural, load-bearing. "I should like that," she said, "very much." Years passed, as years do in great houses, measured not in calendar pages but in harvests and fates and the slow, satisfying accumulation of a life well managed. Elderfield thrived under Isolde's stewardship, its gardens deepening, its tenants prospering, its reputation in the county as a well-run estate becoming so established that it was simply assumed, the way one assumes that the sun will continue to rise over the East Drive each morning. Their first child was born in the autumn of the 4th year, a daughter whom they named Rosalind, and who had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and who, by the age of 3, could name every variety of rose in the garden because the Duchess had taught her. A son followed 2 years later, and then another daughter, an Elderfield filled with the sounds that Isolde had always believed it was built for. Not silence, not formality, but the layered noise of a family and occupation. Caspian sat in the House of Lords during the sessions, as duty required, and when he returned to Elderfield, he brought Isolde detailed accounts of the debates and asked her opinion on the matters before the chamber. Because he had discovered, belatedly but thoroughly, that her judgment was the sharpest instrument available to him. Miss Vane married a baronet in Suffolk. Isolde learned this from a passing mention in a letter from her sister and felt nothing, not satisfaction, not vindication, simply the faint recognition of a chapter that had been closed so thoroughly it no longer contained any heat. It was Caspian who found the note, Not the original that had gone with Miss Vane in the carriage and was presumably long since destroyed or forgotten, but a copy. Isolde had made a copy before sending it, written in the same hand on the same paper, a habit of thoroughness she applied to all her important correspondence. She had placed it in the back of her correspondence case, behind the letters from her sister and the receipts from the milliner, and she had not looked at it since. Caspian found it one winter evening when he was searching her writing desk for sealing wax. His own supply had run out, and he had come to the morning room to borrow hers, a small domestic errand that would have been unthinkable in the early years of their marriage, but was now unremarkable. He opened the correspondence case, moved aside the letters, and there it was. 5 words in Isolde's hand, on Elderfield notepaper, unsealed. He prefers Tuesdays, not Sundays. He stood in the morning room holding the note for a long time. Isolde found him there when she came to collect Roland's drawings, which the child had left on the window seat after her afternoon lesson. "You kept a copy," he said. "I keep copies of all my important correspondence." He looked at her, this woman who had managed his house, raised his children, advised his politics, tended his gardens, and saved his marriage with 5 words and a carriage sent to the gate. And he did not say what she expected him to say, which was something about the past, about regret, about the man he had been. Instead, he said, "Where should I put it?" She considered. The second drawer of the library desk, beneath the household plans. He placed it there himself, in the library, in the desk where the architectural drawings of Elderfield were stored. The original plans from 1742, the garden redesigns, the stable extensions. The note lay among them like a blueprint of a different kind, the plan for a marriage, drawn by the woman who built it. Isolde never mentioned it again. She did not need to. The note had done its work years ago, on a bright Tuesday morning when a carriage arrived at the east gate, expecting welcome and received instead 5 words that rearranged the architecture of everything. She had not sent it in anger. She had not sent it in pain. She had sent it in the voice of a woman who knew her own house, every room, every corridor, every locked drawer, and who had decided, with the quiet certainty that governed all her decisions, exactly how the story would end. They arrive here, like a carriage sent back to the gate, not with anger, not with tears, simply with the quiet certainty of a woman who has already decided how the story ends.